The arrow took the tax collector's guard through the shoulder before Henry Ford even realized his hands had drawn the string, and the man screamed and dropped his torch into the wet heather, and for one heartbeat the whole moor lit up gold and then went dark again. "Down!" Henry shouted, though the woman beside him needed no such warning. Murak Gorehorn was already moving, her curved tusks catching what little moonlight broke through the mist, her greatsword singing free of its harness across her back in a single fluid motion that made the 6 armed men circling them stumble back a pace. She was a mountain given legs, 7 feet of green-gray muscle wrapped in fitted warrior's leathers laced tight across her chest and cinched at her narrow waist, the leather dark with old oil and worn smooth at the places where armor had rubbed against her skin for years. Even now, with blood on the wind and death close enough to taste, Henry could not help but notice how the firelight from the dropped torch caught the clan markings tattooed along her collarbone, swirling black lines that vanished beneath her collar and reappeared at her jaw, older than her, older than the war that had first brought orcs and humans to hate one another across this border moor. "You should have run when I told you to run, Fletcher," she said, not looking at him, her voice a low rumble that he felt in his chest more than heard with his ears. "And leave you to fight 6 of Draven's men alone, some pretend husband I would make." That earned him the flicker of a smile, quick as a knife, gone before the next guard rushed her. She did not kill him. She never killed unless she had to, a thing Henry had learned about her in the 3 weeks since she had first walked into his life and turned it inside out, and instead she caught the man's spear on her forearm guard, twisted, and sent him sprawling into a bog pool with a splash that soaked him to the collarbone and knocked the fight clean out of him. The others hesitated. 6 against 1 orc warrior and 1 lone Fletcher with a hunting bow should have been simple math, but math had never accounted for Murak Gorehorn, and it had certainly never accounted for the fact that Henry Ford could put an arrow through a coin at 80 paces in a crosswind. He loosed again. Another guard went down clutching his thigh, not dead, just done. "Enough!" The voice came from behind the line of guards, oiled and smug, the voice of a man who had never once had to fight for anything in his life. Aldous Pren, the tax collector, sat his fine gray horse at the edge of the standing stones, wrapped in a fur-trimmed cloak that cost more than every croft on this moor put together, and he was smiling the way men like him always smiled when they thought they still held the winning hand. "You wound my men, orc, and you will hang for it. Both of you will hang for it. I have been more than patient with this little border romance of yours, Ford." A Fletcher marrying an orc bride to dodge the clan levy. Clever. But cleverness does not pay debts, and this moor owes me 3 years of unpaid tax, and I intend to collect it in coin or in blood. Henry's jaw tightened. He knocked another arrow, though his supply was thinning, and beside him Murak's grip on her sword did not loosen 1 degree. "You will get neither from me," Murak said, and stepped forward, and the guards who remained standing found reasons to remember urgent business elsewhere. It had not started this way. 3 weeks ago, Henry Ford had been exactly what everyone on the border moor believed him to be. A quiet, competent bowyer with rough hands and a small stone cottage near the standing stones. A man who kept to himself, sold true arrows to hunters and soldiers alike, and had long ago stopped expecting his life to hold anything more than work and solitude. He had buried his mother 2 winters past, and his father before that, and the croft they'd left him was modest but paid for, and he had told himself that was enough. A man could live a whole life on enough. Then the orc warband had come down out of the northern hills, 20 riders strong, banners snapping, and among them had ridden a woman who made every soul in the market town of Ashcombe stop breathing at once. Murak Gorehorn was the daughter of a dead clan chief, cast into a strange half-exile by her own people's politics, her clan mark unrecognized by rivals who wished her disinherited, and married off to end the argument quietly. She had come south not to conquer but to survive, seeking a treaty, seeking safety on human land where the old clan grudges could not reach her, and Ashcombe's frightened town council had done what frightened men always do. They had turned to their tax records and found a name they could sacrifice. Henry Ford. No wife, no children, no family left to grieve him, a man the town would barely notice if he vanished. They had all but shoved him forward into the square and told him this was his chance to be a hero, to marry the Orc chief's daughter in a hasty ceremony that would satisfy the treaty terms Aldous Pren himself had demanded be met before he would permit continued human-orc relations on his taxed border land. And everyone had assumed it would be a quiet, loveless arrangement. A legal fiction to keep the peace and keep the tax collector's soldiers from burning crofts in reprisal for old wars neither Henry nor Murak had fought. He remembered the market square, the mist rolling low between the stalls, the crowd's eyes on him like a physical weight. He remembered looking up at her, actually up, craning his neck because she stood a full head and shoulders above him, and finding not contempt in her golden eyes but a kind of tired, wary appraisal, as though she too had been handed a burden and was deciding how heavy it truly was. "You are the Fletcher," she had said. "Henry Ford," he'd answered, because it had seemed important that she know his name and not just his trade. "And you don't have to do this. Whatever they've told you, whatever they've told me, you don't have to marry a stranger because a tax collector and a scared town council decided it would be convenient." That had surprised her. He'd seen it cross her face, quick and unguarded, before the wariness closed back over it. "You would refuse the arrangement. It would save your neck as much as mine, human. Pren wants his levy, and a mixed marriage sanctioned by both a human town and an Orc clan heir buys us both time he cannot easily overturn." "I didn't say I would refuse it. I said you don't have to." He had shrugged, feeling the crowd's eyes, feeling his own foolish honesty rising up his throat like it always did at the worst possible moments. "I'd rather marry someone who chose it than someone who was only cornered into it, even if it's pretend, even if it's just paper and a ring neither of us means." She had looked at him for a long moment then, this huge, fierce, exiled woman with a warband at her back and a dead father's expectations weighing on her shoulders, and something in her expression had eased just slightly, like a held breath finally let go. "No one has asked me what I want in a very long time," she'd said quietly. "Very well, Fletcher, let us pretend then, convincingly." That had been 3 weeks ago. And in 3 weeks, Henry Ford had learned that pretending to be married to Murak Gorehorn was the easiest lie he had ever told, because within days it had stopped feeling like a lie at all. Now, on the moor, with Aldous Pren's remaining guards regrouping and the tax collector himself glaring down at them from his fine gray horse, Henry realized that the fiction they had built together was about to be tested by more than paperwork. "Last chance, Orc," Pren called. "Pay the levy, or I burn every croft between here and the river, and I will make certain the survivors know it was your presence on this moor that brought the flame. Your people's peace treaty is worth nothing if the humans you claim to protect end up hating you for the fires at their door. You would burn your own tax base to spite one marriage," Murak said flatly. "That is not the act of a clever man. That is the act of a frightened one." Pren's smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes flickered, and Henry, who had spent a lifetime reading the subtle tells of animals in the wood, the flick of an ear, the shift of weight before a startled deer bolted, recognized it for what it was. Fear dressed up as authority, a man who knew he had overreached and was too proud to admit it. 3 days, Pren said instead, wheeling his horse. 3 days to bring me the levy in full, or I return with 20 more men than I brought tonight, and this time I will not offer terms." He spurred away into the mist, his wounded guards limping and stumbling after him, and the moor went quiet except for the wind hissing through the standing stones and the slow drip of blood into wet heather where the coin-shot guard had fallen. Henry lowered his bow at last, his arms trembling faintly with the release of tension, and turned to look at Murak. She was breathing hard, her chest rising and falling beneath the laced leather, a thin cut along one forearm where a spear had grazed her despite her guard, and in the dying light of the dropped torch, her golden eyes found his and held there. "You are hurt," he said, already reaching into the pouch at his belt for the strip of clean linen he always carried, a fletcher's habit, a man who nicked his fingers on fletching knives more often than he liked to admit. "It is nothing. Let me look anyway." She could have refused. She was twice his size and stronger than any 3 men he knew combined, and if she had wanted to walk away from his fussing, she could have done so without breaking stride. Instead, she held out her arm, and he wrapped the linen around the shallow cut with careful, practiced hands, and neither of them spoke for a long moment while he worked, the only sound the wind and the far-off call of a night bird somewhere out in the peat bogs. 3 days, she said finally. 3 days, he agreed. "We don't have a levy's worth of coin between us, Murak. Not close. No." She studied him in the dark, the torch guttering low between them, and something in her voice shifted, quieter now, less the warband leader and more simply the woman standing across from him. "You did not run tonight, Fletcher. You could have. Any sensible man would have. I told you before. I don't run from things that matter to me." He tied off the linen and let his hands fall away from her arm, though he found himself reluctant to step back, reluctant to widen the distance the fight had closed between them. 3 weeks ago you were a stranger the town handed me like a debt to be paid. You're not a stranger anymore." "No," she agreed, and her voice had gone rough in a way he had not heard before. "I do not think I am." They walked back toward the croft in silence after that, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who had fought at each other's backs and found, somewhere in the noise and the fear, that the ground beneath their careful pretending had shifted into something neither of them had planned for, and neither of them, if Henry was honest with himself, particularly wanted to undo. The cottage sat low against the hillside, stone walls thick enough to hold heat through the worst more winters, a single main room with a hearth at one end, and Henry's fletching bench at the other, arrow shafts in various stages of completion laid out in neat rows, fletching feathers sorted by color and size in little clay pots his mother had once used for preserves. It was a small home. It had felt smaller still, rattling and empty, in the years since he had buried the last of his family. It had not felt that way in 3 weeks. Murak ducked through the low doorway, as she always had to, and settled onto the bench by the hearth while Henry knelt to coax the banked coals back to flame. The fire caught slow, orange licking up through kindling, and the small room filled gradually with warm light and the familiar smell of peat smoke. "Pren will not stop at 3 days, Murak said, watching the flames. "Men like him never stop. He has decided we are an insult to his authority, and men who mistake cruelty for authority cannot abide being denied." "I know." Henry sat back on his heels, studying her face in the firelight, the strong jaw, the tusks that curved just past her lower lip, the golden eyes that missed nothing. "We could run, head north back to your people. My people would not have me, not as I am now, exiled and mark disputed, and you would not survive a winter in the high clan territories, Fletcher, no offense meant. Your kind freeze where mine merely shiver." A ghost of dark humor there, and he found himself smiling despite the gravity of the hour. "So we stay, we fight, we find some way to pay a levy we don't have, or we make Pren regret ever riding onto this moor." "You say we very easily," she said, and there was something searching in the way she said it, something that made him realize she was not simply commenting on his choice of words. "Because it is we," he said simply. "Has been for a while now, I think. Longer than either of us has said out loud." The fire popped and settled. Murak did not answer right away, and Henry let the silence stretch, because he had learned in 3 weeks that she was a woman who chose her words with the same deliberate care she chose her sword strokes, and rushing her helped nothing. "When my father died," she said at last, "and the clan council decided I was more useful as a bargaining chip than as an heir, I told myself I did not need anyone. Not the clan, not a husband, not anyone who would only ever see the exile and not the woman. I came south because the alternative was to be married off to some rival's second son to smooth over a dispute I had no part in starting, and I would rather live among humans who feared me honestly than among my own kind who despised me politely. She looked up at him, and the firelight caught the clan mark at her collarbone, the black lines shifting faintly as though alive in the flickering light. I did not expect the Fletcher the town threw at me like a sacrifice to be the first person in years who asked what I wanted. Henry's throat tightened. He moved to sit beside her on the bench, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, close enough that the top of his head barely reached her shoulder even seated. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "I think you're the first person in a long time who's made me feel like my life was worth more than just getting through the next season. I buried my whole family in this cottage, Murak. I got used to being the man nobody in Ashcombe really noticed. And then you rode into that square looking like you could tear the standing stones out of the ground with your bare hands, and you looked at me like I mattered, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since." She turned to face him fully then, and the firelight painted half her face in gold and left the other half in shadow, and Henry found he could not look away from her. "This was supposed to be pretend," she murmured. "I know. I do not think it is pretend anymore. I know that too." She reached out, slow, careful, as though she expected him to flinch, and cupped the side of his face in one enormous hand, her thumb brushing along his jaw with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible given the strength he had watched that same hand wield a greatsword only an hour before. Henry did not flinch. He leaned into her touch instead, and something in her golden eyes broke open, soft and unguarded, and when she bent her head down to close the distance between them, he met her halfway. The kiss was careful at first, both of them navigating the strange geometry of her size and his, but then her hand slid to the back of his neck and drew him closer, and the carefulness burned away into something hungrier, something that had clearly been building for 3 weeks under the surface of every shared meal, and every quiet night by the fire, and every moment she had stood too close, watched too long, found excuses to remain in the same room. Henry's hands found her waist, felt the laced leather warm from the fire, felt her breath catch against his mouth, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing as hard as they had after the fight on the moor. "I have wanted to do that," Murak said, her voice rough, "since the second week." "I have wanted you to do that since the market square," Henry admitted, and she laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, a sound he had only heard from her a handful of times and had come to treasure each one. "You hit it well, Fletcher. You're terrifying. A man learns to be subtle around terrifying women. I am not terrifying to you." "No," he agreed, reaching up to trace his thumb along the edge of her jaw, marveling at how she went still and pliant under his touch. This woman who feared nothing and no one, who had fought 6 armed men without hesitation an hour ago. "You're not terrifying to me at all." They did not go further that night, though the pull toward it hummed under everything they said and did. Instead, they sat together by the fire until the coals burned low, her arm around his shoulders, his head resting against her side, and for the first time since her father's death, Murak Gorehorn found herself thinking that exile might not be a punishment after all, if it had led her here. The 3 days Pren had granted them passed in a blur of frantic, practical work. Henry called on what few connections he had in Ashcombe, a blacksmith who owed him for a rush order of hunting arrows, an innkeeper who had always liked him well enough, a handful of crofters who had grown fond of the quiet Fletcher over the years, and found, to his surprise, that people were more willing to help than the town council's earlier cowardice had suggested. It was not the council that had thrown him to Pren's demands. It had simply been too frightened to refuse. The ordinary folk of the border, it turned out, resented Aldous Pren's levies as much as anyone, and word of an orc bride who had fought off 6 armed men to protect her human husband had spread through the market stalls faster than Henry could have anticipated. "They are calling you a hero," Murak told him on the second evening, amusement warring with something warmer in her voice, as they walked back from Ashcombe with a borrowed cart of supplies. the Fletcher who stood his ground beside his orc wife. "I'm no hero, I just didn't run. That is precisely what makes a hero in my experience." She glanced sideways at him, and the look in her eyes made his chest feel tight in the best possible way. "My people tell stories of warriors who never flinched even when the odds should have broken them. You would fit well in such a story, Henry Ford. I'd rather fit well in a story with you in it than any story about myself." That earned him another of her rare, unguarded smiles, and she reached over without breaking stride and laced her fingers through his, her hand swallowing his entirely, and they walked the rest of the way back to the cottage like that, hand in hand under a sky gone the color of old bruises with the coming dusk. But the goodwill of frightened crofters could only stretch so far, and by the evening of the third day it had become clear that no amount of borrowed coin, traded goods, or called-in favors would add up to the sum Pren demanded. Henry sat at his fletching bench that night, staring at a half-finished arrow shaft he had no memory of picking up, while Murak paced the small room like a caged storm. "We do not have it," she said. "Not even half." "I know." "Then we prepare for what comes instead." She stopped pacing and looked at him, her jaw set, her hand drifting unconsciously to the hilt of the sword she had propped against the wall by the door. "Pren will not come with 6 men this time. He will come with 20, perhaps more, and he will not offer terms." "Then we won't be here waiting for him to knock on the door," Henry said, and something in his tone made her turn fully to face him. "The standing stones, the old ones out past the bog where we fought his guards 3 nights ago. What of them? They're narrow ground. A rider can't bring 20 men through the stones abreast, not with the bog on either side. It funnels them down to 2, maybe 3 at a time." He stood, moved to the wall where his bow hung, ran his fingers along the familiar curve of the wood. "I've hunted that moor my whole life, Murak. I know every bog channel, every dry path through the heather that looks solid but isn't. If we make our stand there, on ground I know and Pren's men don't, we change the numbers that matter." She studied him for a long moment, and he watched calculation and something like pride move across her face in equal measure. "You are proposing we fight 20 armed men with a bow, a sword, and the terrain." "I'm proposing we fight 20 armed men with a bow, a sword, the terrain, and every crofter on this moor who's sick of paying Pren's levy while their children go hungry." He met her eyes steadily. "I sent word today, while you were readying the horses. Told them what's coming, told them what it would mean for all of us if Pren wins this and decides burning crofts is an acceptable way to collect a debt. Half the moor is coming to stand with us at the stones tomorrow at dawn." Murak crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled him into her arms, and for a moment Henry simply let himself be held, his cheek against the warm leather over her heart, listening to its steady, powerful beat. "You did not have to make this your fight," she said quietly into his hair. "You could have let me face him alone, or fled north, or made whatever peace a Fletcher can make with a corrupt collector who only wanted coin." "It was already my fight," Henry murmured back. "It became my fight the day you looked at me in that market square like I was worth something. I'm not going to let some greedy tax collector take that away from either of us." She pulled back just enough to look down at him, and the fierceness in her golden eyes had softened into something that looked almost like wonder. "No one has fought for me before," she said. "Not truly, not without expecting something owed in return." "I don't want anything owed," Henry said. "I just want you." She kissed him then, slow and deep, and this time when they finally drew apart there was no more talk of pretending, no more careful hedging about what this was or was not between them. They both knew. They had known for days. The battle waiting for them at dawn only made the truth of it burn brighter, the way firelight burns brighter against full dark. That night, for the first time, she stayed in his arms until morning, and though the coming dawn carried the weight of 20 armed men and a corrupt tax collector's rage, Henry Ford had never in his life felt less afraid of what tomorrow might bring. Dawn broke gray and misted over the standing stones, the kind of low, clinging fog the moor was famous for, thick enough to swallow sound and turned familiar shapes into looming gray ghosts. Henry stood at the narrow gap between two ancient stones with his quiver full and his bow strung, and around him, scattered along the dry paths through the bog that only he and a handful of old crofters knew by heart, stood perhaps 30 men and women of the border moor, armed with hunting bows, pitchforks, old family swords pulled down from mantles where they had rusted since the last war. It was not an army. It was a collection of frightened, furious people who had finally decided that fear of Aldous Pren was worse than the risk of standing against him. Murak stood beside Henry at the center of the gap, her greatsword drawn, her warrior's leathers catching what pale light broke through the mist, and when the first sound of hooves and marching feet reached them through the fog, she reached over and squeezed his shoulder once, hard, grounding. "Whatever happens," she said, "you have already given me more than I ever thought to ask for." "Save that for after," Henry said, though his throat was tight. "I intend to hear you say it again tonight by the fire when this is over." Pren's force emerged from the mist like a nightmare taking shape, not 20 men, but closer to 30, mounted and armed, banners of the tax authority snapping stiff in the damp wind. Aldous Pren himself at their head on his fine gray horse, his face twisted with fury at the sight of the gathered crofters blocking his path. "You dare," he snarled. "You dare raise arms against the Crown's own tax authority. We dare raise arms against a thief who hides behind a crown seal," called old Tam Wicklow, a crofter Henry had known his whole life, standing at the edge of the bog with a rusted family blade in his shaking but determined hands. "You have bled this moor dry for 3 years, Pren. No more." Pren's face went purple with rage, and he raised his hand to signal the charge, and Henry's heart hammered as he drew his first arrow and sighted down the narrow gap between the stones, praying the terrain would do what he had promised it would do. It did. The mounted guards, forced to funnel 2 and 3 abreast through the gap, lost the crushing advantage of their numbers the moment they entered the standing stones. Henry's first arrow took the lead rider's horse in a spot too well placed and too well practiced to be anything but the work of the border's finest fletcher, and the animal reared and threw its rider into the bog, and the men behind him piled up in confusion at the sudden obstruction. Murak did not wait for them to sort themselves out. She surged forward into the gap, greatsword flashing, and where Henry's arrows found unarmored gaps and horses' flanks to disable rather than kill, Murak's blade found shields and spear hafts, knocking weapons from hands, using her superior strength to disarm rather than slaughter, though her restraint did nothing to make her any less devastating an opponent. Man after man found himself dismounted, disarmed, or simply flung bodily into the bog pools, and the crofters at the flanks loosed arrows and hurled stones from the cover of the standing stones, harrying Pren's forces from every side, until the narrow gap became a chaos of confusion and retreat rather than the crushing massacre Pren had planned. But numbers, even hampered by terrain, eventually tell, and as the fighting stretched on, Henry felt his quiver growing lighter and Murak's movements, though still lethal, growing slower with the accumulated weight of the fight. A guard broke through on the flank, past the crofters' harrying fire, and came at Henry with a spear leveled, and Henry had no more arrows knocked and no time to draw one, and for one heart-stopping moment he thought this was where it ended, on a misted moor, 3 weeks into the first real love he had ever known. Then Murak was there, impossibly fast for her size, throwing herself between Henry and the spear point, taking the glancing blow across her ribs rather than letting it find him, and she roared not in pain, though he could see the pain in the tightness of her jaw, but in fury, and disarmed the guard with a single brutal strike before rounding on Henry with fear plain in her eyes for the first time since he had known her. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine, you're bleeding." "It is nothing, I have had worse." "Murak, behind you." She snarled instead, and Henry spun and put an arrow through the thigh of another approaching guard, and there was no more time for argument as the fight surged around them again. It was Aldous Pren himself who finally broke the tide, not through courage but through desperation. Seeing his forces faltering, his men fleeing or disarmed, his fine plan of overwhelming numbers dissolved into chaos among the standing stones, he spurred his gray horse forward in a final, reckless charge, a long dueling blade drawn, aiming not for Murak, whom he perhaps rightly feared, but for Henry, the smaller, more vulnerable target. The Fletcher he had dismissed as beneath notice 3 weeks ago, and had come to hate with the particular venom small tyrants reserve for those who refuse to be cowed. Henry saw the charge coming and had exactly one arrow left in his quiver. He did not miss. The arrow took Pren through the sword arm at full draw, close enough that Henry could see the shock bloom across the tax collector's face as his blade fell from suddenly useless fingers, and his horse, panicked by its rider's cry of pain, reared and threw him hard into the boggy earth at the base of one of the ancient standing stones. He did not rise. Around them, the remaining guards, seeing their leader downed and disarmed, seeing the crofters and the massive orc warrior and the Fletcher who could not seem to miss a shot even under the worst pressure, began throwing down their weapons in surrender, the fight bleeding out of the moor as quickly as the mist began, at last, to burn away under a rising sun. It was over. Henry stood in the sudden, ringing silence, his bow arm trembling, and looked around at the standing stones, at the scattered, disarmed guards, at old Tam Wicklow leaning heavily on his rusted blade but grinning fiercely through a bloodied lip, at the crofters slowly emerging from their cover with disbelieving joy dawning on their faces, and finally at Murak, who stood in the center of the gap between the stones with her greatsword lowered, blood on her leathers that was not entirely her own. Watching him with an expression he had never seen on her face before, something raw, something that looked almost like disbelief at having survived, at having won, at still having him standing whole and breathing at the end of it. "Murak," he breathed and crossed the muddy ground to her in 3 strides, and she caught him against her, one arm banding around him hard enough to lift him briefly off his feet, and he felt her whole body shaking with the aftermath of the fight, adrenaline and fear and fierce, blazing relief all tangled together. "You held," she said into his hair, her voice thick. "I told you to run if it turned against us, and you held your ground beside me instead. I told you before, I don't run from things that matter to me." He pulled back just enough to look up at her face, to see the tears standing unshed in her golden eyes, this warrior who had faced down 30 armed men without flinching, now undone by nothing more than the sight of him still breathing. "You saved my life back there, took a spear that was meant for me. I would take 1,000 spears for you," she said, fierce and unguarded, "and think the exchange still favored me." Around them, the crofters had begun the work of binding Pren's wound, disarming his remaining guards, gathering up the scattered weapons, and the tax collector's own confiscated ledgers from his saddlebags, ledgers that old Tam Wicklow soon discovered with a low whistle of disgust, showed years of levies collected far beyond what the crown had ever actually demanded, coin that had lined Pren's own pockets rather than any royal treasury. It was evidence enough, the crofters agreed among themselves, to see the man stripped of his authority and sent east to face the crown's own justice rather than the Moors, evidence enough that no levy would ever again bleed this border dry the way Pren's greed had bled it these past 3 years. But Henry heard little of the practical aftermath unfolding around him. He had eyes only for Murak, who held him as though she meant never to let go, and for a long moment, standing in the mud and the fading mist among the ancient standing stones, the two of them simply breathed together, alive, whole, and no longer pretending anything at all. They did not speak of the deeper meaning of the day until that evening, when the crofters had dispersed back to their homes, with promises of gratitude and invitations to feast that Henry knew would come sincerely once the shock wore off, when Pren had been bound and carted off toward the county seat under armed escort with his own damning ledgers as the chief witness against him, And when the cottage by the standing stone stood quiet again, lit only by hearth fire, holding just the two of them. Murak sat on the bench by the fire, stripped of her outer leather vest, her undertunic damp with sweat and old blood, the shallow spear wound along her ribs cleaned and bound by Henry's careful, unhurried hands. He knelt before her in the firelight, finishing the last wrap of linen, and when he looked up she was watching him with an intensity that made his breath catch. "You have not asked me," she said quietly, "about the mark." Henry's gaze drifted, as it had so many times over the past 3 weeks, to the black lines tattooed along her collarbone, visible now above the loosened collar of her undertunic, curling up toward her jaw in patterns he had always found beautiful without ever fully understanding. "I didn't want to pry," he admitted. "It felt like something private, something that belonged to your people, not to me." "It is a clan mark," she said, "given at birth to every daughter and son of Gorehorn blood. It marks lineage, belonging, the line of chiefs stretching back further than either of our peoples care to remember accurately." Her voice roughened. "When my father died and the council disputed my claim, they told me the mark meant nothing without their recognition, that I was Gorehorn in blood but not in standing. I have carried it for years now, feeling as though it were a lie inked into my own skin." "It's not a lie," Henry said fiercely, surprising himself with the heat in his own voice. "Whatever some frightened council decided in your absence, that mark is yours. It's part of who you are. I don't need anyone's recognition to see that." Something in her expression cracked open then, vulnerable in a way he had rarely seen from her, and she reached out and drew him up from where he knelt, guiding him to sit beside her on the bench, close, her hand still wrapped around his. "There is a custom," she said slowly, "among my people, though it has fallen out of common practice among the southern clans. When a warrior chooses a mate in the heat of a shared victory, when a battle has been fought and won together, side by side, life risked for life, the mark may be shared, open to another's touch. It is not done lightly. It is not done for convenience or pretense or treaty." Her golden eyes held his, steady despite the tremor he could feel in her hand. "It is done only when the heart has already decided, and the battle simply gives it the courage to be spoken aloud." Henry's own heart was pounding now, his mouth suddenly dry. "Murak, I am asking," she said, "if you would touch it. If you would let this be real between us, not because a council or a tax collector or a frightened town forced it, but because I have chosen you, Henry Ford, with my whole heart, and I do not wish to pretend any longer." He reached for her without hesitation, his hand trembling slightly as it rose toward her collarbone, and she went very still, watching him with an openness that undid something in his chest. "Tell me if I do this wrong," he murmured. "You will not do it wrong." His fingers found the edge of the mark where it curved along her collarbone, tracing the black lines with careful reverence, and the moment his skin touched hers, the mark began to glow. It was not the flicker of firelight reflecting off ink. It was something else entirely, a warm golden light rising up from beneath her skin along every curling line of the tattoo, pulsing once, twice, in time with the beat of her heart, and Murak gasped, a sound caught somewhere between shock and pleasure, her hand flying up to grip his wrist, not to stop him but to hold him there, to keep his touch exactly where it was. "Murak." His voice was barely a whisper. "It has not done that," she breathed, "since my father held me as a child. It only answers to a bond the heart has already sealed." Her eyes had gone wide, luminous in the firelight, fixed on his face with an intensity that stole the breath from his lungs. "It is answering to you." He traced the edge of the glowing mark again, slower this time, following the curve where it disappeared beneath her collar and reappeared near her jaw, and with each pass of his fingers the golden light pulsed brighter, warmer, and Murak's breathing grew ragged, her free hand rising to cup the back of his neck, drawing him closer. "Say my name," she whispered, and there was something almost pleading in it, this proud warrior who had never begged anyone for anything. "Murak," he said. "Murak Gorehorn." Again. "Murak." He said it against her jaw now, having leaned in without quite realizing he'd moved, his lips brushing the humming warmth of her skin, where the mark's glow had spread. "Murak!" She made a sound low in her throat, something between a growl and a sigh, and pulled him fully against her. And in the golden light of the mark and the firelight both, Henry Ford found that he had, for one dizzying, perfect moment, entirely forgotten there was anything in the world to think about except the woman in his arms. No fear of Pren, no memory of the fight, no thought of tomorrow's practicalities. Nothing but her name in his mouth and her heartbeat against his palm and the impossible. Glowing proof that whatever this was between them, it was no longer pretend, had perhaps never truly been pretend at all, not since the very first moment she had looked at him in that market square, and asked without words whether he might be someone worth choosing. "I forgot," he murmured against her skin, dazed. "For a second there, I forgot my own name." Murak laughed, low and warm and utterly undone, and drew his face up to hers. "Good," she said. "Then you understand exactly how I have felt every day since you refused to let a town council make me your obligation instead of your choice." He kissed her then, deep and unhurried, and she gathered him against her chest with a tenderness that belied every ounce of the strength he had watched her wield in battle. And the firelight and the golden glow of the mark mingled together, until Henry could not have said where one ended and the other began, only that he was held, entirely and without reservation, by a woman who had chosen him above every other path open to her, and that he had never in his life felt less alone. What followed was not rushed, though the heat between them had been building for weeks, and the victory of the day left them both raw and alive in a way that made every touch feel more vivid than the last. Murak drew him with her toward the sleeping pallet at the far side of the room, moving with a careful deliberateness that spoke of a woman used to being far stronger than whatever she held and determined never to let that strength become anything but gentleness with him. Henry's hands found the laces of her undertunic, and hers found the ties of his shirt, and the fire burned low and steady while they learned each other slowly, reverently, the glow of her clan mark pulsing softly against his palm wherever he touched it, as though her very blood answered the fact of him. There were no more words needed for a long while, only her name murmured against his skin and his against hers, only the warmth of the hearth and the deeper warmth beneath it. And when at last they lay tangled together beneath a worn wool blanket, her arm heavy and protective across his chest, her breathing slow, and even for the first time in what felt like years, Henry thought he had never known a peace so complete. "I have never done that before," Murak admitted quietly into the dark, her fingers tracing idle patterns against his shoulder. "Opened the mark, meant it the way it is meant to be meant. I've never had anyone look at me the way you looked at me tonight," Henry said. "Like I was the only thing worth seeing in the whole room." "You are," she said simply, no hesitation in it at all, and he felt the truth of it settle into his bones like warmth after a long cold season, and he slept that night more soundly than he had in years. In the days that followed, word of the Standing Stones battle spread far beyond the border moor, carried by grateful crofters and traveling merchants alike, until the tale of the Fletcher and his orc bride who had turned back a corrupt tax collector's private army became something close to legend along the whole frontier. Aldous Pren's crimes, laid bare by his own confiscated ledgers, saw him stripped of his authority and his ill-gotten wealth by the Crown's own investigators, who arrived within the fortnight to interview witnesses and confirm that the border moors levies would be reduced to fair and lawful rates going forward, with reparations promised to the crofters who had suffered under 3 years of Pren's greed. It was not a perfect justice. Henry suspected men like Pren rarely faced the full weight of what they deserved, but it was enough to lift the fear that had hung over the moor for years, enough to let people breathe easier at their hearths without dreading the next visit from a man who saw them only as coin to be extracted. More than that, though, the battle changed how Ashcombe and the surrounding crofts saw the strange marriage that had been forced upon them weeks before. Where once there had been wary glances and murmured prejudice whenever Murak walked the market stalls, Now there was gratitude, cautious at first and then genuine, as crofters who had fought beside her at the standing stones told, and retold the story of the orc warrior who had shielded their neighbor's son with her own body, who had disarmed rather than slaughtered where slaughter would have been easier, who had proven with steel and restraint both that the old hatreds between their peoples need not be the only story worth telling. Old Tam Wicklow, in particular, took to greeting Murak by name whenever their paths crossed in the market, always with a respectful nod that had once, weeks ago, been suspicion, and once memorably with an offer of his best cut of mutton, for the woman who took a spear meant for our Fletcher, which Murak had accepted with a graciousness that made Henry's chest ache with quiet pride. Word also reached, eventually and inevitably, the northern clan lands where Murak's exile had begun. A rider came one gray afternoon 3 months after the battle at the Standing Stones, bearing the colors of the Gorehorn clan council, and Henry watched Murak's face go carefully neutral in the way it always did when she was bracing herself against old wounds, and he stood beside her at the cottage door while the rider, a weathered orc warrior named Skarn, whom Murak seemed to recognize with wary surprise, dismounted and offered a formal, if stiff, greeting. "The council has heard of the battle at the Standing Stones," Skarn said, his gaze flicking between Murak and Henry with open curiosity. "Of the human Fletcher who fought at your side, and of the mark that opened for him in the old way, witnessed by more than a dozen human crofters who have not stopped telling the tale since." He paused, and something in his stern face softened fractionally. "The council wishes me to say that a warrior who commands such loyalty, who is chosen so completely by the old marks in front of witnesses, cannot easily be called unworthy of her lineage. Your claim to the Gorehorn name stands recognized, Murak, daughter of Grendak. The council rescinds its earlier dispute." Murak went very still, her hand finding Henry's without looking, gripping it tightly enough that he felt the tremor running through her. "After everything," she said, her voice carefully even despite the emotion straining beneath it, "it is a marriage to a human Fletcher, and not any deed of my own, that finally convinces them." "It is the mark's own judgment that convinces them," Skarn corrected gently. "The old ways do not lie, even when councils would prefer they did." "Your father would have been proud, Murak Gorehorn. I thought you should hear that said plainly from someone who knew him." He did not stay long after that, mounting up and riding back north before dusk, but Murak stood in the cottage doorway for a long while after he had gone, watching the empty moor road, and when Henry finally moved to stand beside her, wrapping an arm as far as it would reach around her waist, she turned into him and let herself, for just a moment, simply lean. "I never thought," she murmured against his hair, "that I would find belonging again. Not after my father died, not after the council cast doubt on everything I was. I thought exile was simply what my life would be now." "You found it anyway," Henry said. "You found it here, on a moor you'd never seen before, with a Fletcher the town threw at you like an afterthought." "I did not find it," she corrected, drawing back just enough to look down at him, her golden eyes bright with unshed tears and something that looked unmistakably like joy. "I chose it. I chose you. Every day since that first morning in the market square, I have chosen you again, and I will go on choosing you for as long as you will have me." "That's a very long time to plan on," Henry said, his own voice thick. "Good," Murak said. "I intend to make full use of it." That evening, they walked together out to the Standing Stones, the site of their shared battle transformed now, in the golden hour before sunset, into something quieter and more peaceful, just ancient rock and heather, and the long shadows of evening stretching across the moor. Murak had asked, softly, if they might go, and Henry had understood without needing to ask why. Some places needed to be remembered not only for the fear and blood they had held, but for what had been won there. They stood together at the center of the gap between the two largest stones, where they had fought side by side against Pren's men, and Murak reached up and unlaced the collar of her tunic just enough to bear the clan mark fully to the fading light. It did not glow now, not without his touch, but even unlit it seemed to hold some quiet dignity, some settled peace that had not been there weeks ago. "There is one more custom," she said, "that I did not tell you about that first night by the fire." "Tell me now." "When a mark opens fully, not just to touch, but to a bond both hearts have chosen freely, without coercion, without pretense, the clan considers it a binding as true as any spoken vow. My people would call us married in truth now, Fletcher, whatever paper the tax collector's demand once forced upon us." She took his hand and pressed it flat against the mark, over her heart, and even without firelight to draw out its glow, Henry could feel the warmth of her skin, the steady drum of her heartbeat beneath his palm. "I do not need any council's blessing to know what I feel. But I wanted you to know, plainly in words, that whatever began as a pretend courtship to satisfy a corrupt man's demands has become the truest thing I have ever known." "I love you," Henry said, the words coming easier than he had ever imagined they could, standing there in the long gold light with the woman who had upended his quiet, lonely life and filled it instead with something fierce and warm and entirely unexpected. "I loved you before I understood what I was feeling, Murak. I think I loved you from the moment you told me no one had asked what you wanted in a long time, and I decided right then that I was going to be someone who asked." "I love you," she said back, simply, steadily, no hesitation in it at all, the way she said everything that mattered to her. "I love you, Henry Ford, Fletcher of the border moor, the man who did not run." He kissed her there among the standing stones, slow and certain, with the whole wide moor stretching out gold and quiet around them, and when they finally drew apart Murak laughed, bright and unguarded, a sound that carried out across the heather like something newly free. "What?" Henry asked, smiling despite himself at the sight of her joy. "I was simply thinking," she said, "that the town council meant to hand me an obligation, and instead they handed me the rest of my life." "Poor planning on their part." "The very best poor planning I have ever encountered," she agreed, and drew him back into her arms. They did not linger forever at the stones, though Henry suspected they would return often in the years to come, this place having become something sacred to them, both in ways neither the Crofters nor the Crown nor even Murak's own clan council could fully understand. As dusk settled fully over the moor, they walked back together toward the cottage, hand in hand, the small stone home glowing warm and welcoming in the gathering dark, smoke curling gently from its chimney where they had left the hearth banked that morning. There was still work to do, of course. There always was, on a border moor where seasons turned hard and fast and a bowyer's trade never truly rested, where crofters still needed arrows for hunting through the long winters, and where Murak, freed now of her clan's dispute and welcomed rather than merely tolerated by Ashcombe's grateful townsfolk, had begun teaching some of the braver local youths the sword work that had saved so many lives at the Standing Stones. But it was good work, chosen work, the kind that filled a life rather than simply passing the time until the next hardship arrived. Aldous Pren never returned to trouble the border moor again. Word came some months later that he had been stripped of all title and wealth by the Crown's investigators and sent to labor out his remaining years in a distant quarry, his corruption, too, thoroughly documented by his own ledgers to escape judgment. The levies on the moor settled into something fair, something the crofters could bear without fear, and the Standing Stones, once a place of desperate last stands, became instead a favorite gathering spot for the local children, who liked to hear old Tam Wicklow retell the story of the Fletcher's impossible shot and the Orc bride's fearless charge, embellishing it a little more with each telling until Henry, overhearing one version in the market square, could not help but laugh at how thoroughly he had apparently single-handedly defeated 30 men, without the help of a single arrow-loosing crofter or one Murak Gorehorn. "They will have you slaying dragons next," Murak told him, amused, as they walked home from the market one evening some months after the battle, her hand resting warm and easy in his, no longer a strange or careful thing between them, but simply how they walked now always. "As long as they keep your part of the story straight," Henry said. "You're the one who actually did the impossible thing. I just happened to have decent aim." "You had faith," she corrected. "In the terrain, in the crofters, in me." "That is no small thing, Fletcher, whatever modest words you wrap it in." They reached the cottage as the sun dipped low over the moor, painting the standing stones gold in the distance, and Henry paused at the door to look back at her. This magnificent, fierce, devoted woman who had walked into his quiet life and refused to let it stay small, who had chosen him not out of obligation or convenience, but out of something real and freely given, who wore her clan mark now not as a wound, but as a badge of the belonging she had fought for and finally won. On both sides of the border that had once tried so hard to keep them apart. "What?" she asked, catching him watching her, one dark brow raised in that familiar fond challenge. "Nothing," Henry said, smiling. "Just glad I didn't run." "So am I," Murak said, and drew him inside, into the warm firelight waiting for them both, into the life they had built together out of a forced arrangement and a shared battle and a mark that had glowed gold in the dark and told them both, more clearly than either had dared say aloud, exactly where they belonged. They stayed on the moor through that winter and every winter after, the cottage growing warmer each year not from any change in its stone walls but from what filled it now: laughter, argument, reconciliation, the steady rhythm of two lives grown so thoroughly entwined that neither could quite recall, nor wish to recall, what solitude had felt like before. Murak's sword hung above the hearth beside Henry's finest bow, both weapons kept sharp and ready, though the Moor had known no trouble since Pren's fall, more symbol now than necessity, a reminder of the battle that had forged something neither of them had expected to find. And on quiet evenings, when the fire burned low and gold, Henry would sometimes reach across the small distance between them and trace the edge of her clan mark, feeling it warm and glowing faintly beneath his fingers, and Murak would close her eyes and lean into his touch. And for a moment, just as it had been that very first night, the whole world would narrow down to nothing but the two of them, chosen and choosing, free at last to simply be exactly what they had become. "Say my name," she would murmur every time, though she no longer needed to ask. And every time, without fail, Henry Ford would say it: Murak, Murak Gorehorn, and mean it more completely than he had ever meant anything in his life, and she would smile against his skin, and outside the standing stones would stand silent and eternal in the dark, keeping watch over the small stone cottage where a Fletcher and his orc bride had built, out of fire and courage, and a battle no one expected them to survive. A love that neither the Moor's harsh seasons, nor any tax collector's greed, nor any council's old prejudice could ever again put asunder.